interesting time today. Yona has decided to change the format a little bit. We've got a couple of great folks here, two very distinguished ambassadors, and I'll let Yona introduce them in detail here in a moment. But today, what we would like to do really is encourage more dialogue and more discussion with the distinguished folks that we have in the audience, including our interns. Don't be afraid to think about things, ask questions. I particularly think it's exciting when the young people speak. I get tired of hearing these old folks all the time, but I like to hear what the young people have to say. And so I would encourage all of you to have some dialogue. And this is a very, very complex topic today, really. It's a very interesting one. It's easy to say, well, we should have more diplomacy, we should do more of this, more of that, et cetera, et cetera. But the art and the science of diplomacy is quite a complicated issue. And if you really think about it, look at our history, look at what we've tried to accomplish over the many years of being a republic and a democracy, you'll understand how difficult it is. Many times it has to be adaptive. It has to be regionally focused and sometimes nationally focused on different countries and the like. It has to also take into account the culture, the mores, the languages, the people. In other words, what I've said many times, it's essential that our foreign relations, our diplomacy, our thought process take a look at the world and take a look at the people through their eyes as opposed to our eyes. I make this comment frequently, and that's not always done either. And so with that as an introduction, I'll turn it over to you if you're finally got your act together. Okay.
We'll try.
Well, I mean, you've been kind of buzzing around here.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'm kind of worried about you. I thought maybe you forgot your notes.
no, I didn't forget my notes. Okay, great. Thank you very much, as always, General, for your kind introduction. And although I'm going to introduce our panel, of course, the General is gracious to join us all the time to provide some context and clarity to our discussion. So we decided to encourage dialogue with the audience, those who are academics and those who are in the diplomatic service and all that. So let me first introduce the speakers now. Unfortunately, Ambassador Ed Marks had a personal medical emergency call that he's unable to participate, but his remarks and the contribution is going to be published. As you know, we're trying to provide the information to a wider audience. We do have reports of basically each topic or seminar or research, whatever it is. So again, Ed is with us, obviously with his spirit and some of the questions that we'll raise. So basically, I would like to introduce to the General's left, Ambassador Charles Ray, who was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW, the missing personnel, and ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe, and participating in many activities for a long time in the U.S. Military. I like to mention That's in honor of the military that contributes to our national and global security concerns. He served 20 years in the U.S. Army. I'd like to mention his 2 tours in Vietnam, and he contributed to the military intelligence, and he had also tours in Germany and Korea, Panama, and so forth. After his retirement of 30 years, actually, in foreign service, he was also posted in China. I have a long list, and I mentioned Cambodia and Zimbabwe, and in Vietnam. Currently is a member of the American Foreign Service Association, and we are blessed to have him to provide some guidance on the role of the diplomats from the academic point of view. And he's also a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Our other distinguished panelists to Ambassador Zwade left is Ambassador Jo Ellen Powell, and she was appointed as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Resources, one of her assignments, and also she was a senior advisor to the Director General of the Foreign Service. In addition to that, she was appointed to be an ambassador to Mauritania, but she served also in Europe. She had many appointments, for example, in Germany. And then I think what is really important that her service included work in Jordan, as well as Beirut and Rome and France and even Australia. What is really interesting in reading the bios of people, she grew up in a foreign service family, living all the way from Panama to Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, India, Iran, and Laos. So welcome to our seminar today. We're looking forward to get your views. Now, as always, I think we're trying to remember the victims of terrorism, whether ordinary citizens or diplomats or the military. So we try always to recall their service and express our condolences, and also acknowledge, obviously, the role of the first responders, the police, the firefighters, the military around the world. And General Gray obviously provides leadership for decades and decades, and the role of diplomats. So with this note, to remember and never forget, but it is equally important to learn the lessons of history. I'm not, as an academic, obviously I'm tempted always to provide some long context, and my students or interns know about this, but I assure you I'm going to be very brief. But there is something on my mind, and what's on my mind basically is, on a daily basis, it is astonishing that we're surprised about the surprise in terms of the threats. And even as of this morning, but we want to look at the record. We can look at the record, let's say, of the Bible, going all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel, and the negotiations about my brother's keeper and all that, or the origins of nations, going all the way back to Noah, the second father, I think, of mankind. He had 3 sons, as we know, Shem, Ham, and Yafet, and all that. So going all the way back historically. If I may, to put it in context, a century ago, actually on June 28th, 1914, as many of you know, the Archduke of Austria and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia at the time, by a Bosnian, actually Serb nationalist and all that. And this act contributed, however partially, to the outbreak of World War I. So again, one can look at a very long list of presidents, leaders, diplomats, members of parliaments, and so on, who were assassinated over the years. And the whole question is whether we learn from history some of the lessons. And if I may, this morning, when I turned on the TV to find out what happened over the night, there were a number of, I think, reports that I'd like to mention very quickly, I think, as a framework for our discussion. One is the report about the Grand Mosque in Mosul that was destroyed by the members of the Islamic State. And this is the third anniversary now in June, going all the way back to 2014, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi spoke, as we know, right there to establish the so-called caliphate without borders. So the lesson, I think, again from that, even if there is going to be a military defeat, Mosul liberated, and then Raqqa and all that, we can maybe destroy symbols, but we cannot destroy, I think, the concepts. And even if you lose territory, the question is, what's next? So that's one of the issues that I think we have to discuss in terms of, is there a role for diplomacy to deal with that kind of challenge, the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or any other group? Secondly, another report this morning was about aviation security, all the way from threats to blow up airplanes, to kidnap airplanes, and all that, as we know very well. And in fact, if we look at the anniversaries of June, the month of June, we're trying to keep a record. What can we learn? Exactly in 1976, in the month of June, I think the 27th or so, Air France airplane with passengers, hundreds of them were hijacked by the Badr minor group and a Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They were brought to Uganda. We're talking about hijacking, and in fact the report today was about hijacking as well as blowing up airplanes. And again, this month of June, we marked the anniversary going back to 1985 of the bombing of Air India over the Atlantic, when 329 people were killed, and those who perpetrated the act were terrorists, Sikh and Kashmiri, in regard to the conflict with India. Finally, one more, I think, event that is very, very important in the context of the threat and response. And again, going all the way back to 1994, in June, there was the first attack in Japan using, at that time, sarin gas. And the following year, in Tokyo, there was an attack, and thousands of people were affected. So we are dealing also with the threats of weapons of mass destruction. So again, we're covering, I think, the chronology of threats to the societies in general and the diplomats and their facilities and their operation throughout the world for decades. And I think we are fortunate to have two members here of the U.S. diplomatic community who went through for decades their challenge, how to deal with this, how to respond to that, and whether there is any need to recommend some new steps in order to facilitate the role of diplomacy. So with that, I would like to invite you. You can come here or you can sit there, and for a few minutes to make a brief introductory comments or opening statement. And then as a moderator, if I may, I would like to ask a few questions very briefly and then involve the audience.
Oh, thank you.
Ambassador?
If I may, I'll sit. I've been on my feet all morning with a bunch of juniors and seniors over at Howard, and my knees are telling me to sit for this one. As Dr. Alexander has said, we've lived with terrorism and extremist violence for many decades now. As I was thinking about what to say, I did sort of what he did. I went to Google and a few other search engines, and I looked at terrorist incidents over the years, and I actually went all the way back to, for example, some of the first bombings of our embassy in Saigon in the 60s and 70s, when the VC used truck bombs to attack the American embassy there. What I sort of concluded is while the incidents themselves, regardless of the number of casualties, physical casualties they generate, while they're local, it's the intent of the organizations who carry out such actions that they have a much broader impact. And in fact, most of these incidents, even some of the smaller ones, let's for a moment forget about 9/11 and the horrific number of casualties, but even incidents generating a small number of casualties, such as the disabled American who was killed when an Italian cruise liner was hijacked in the Mediterranean, have an international effect and impact. And this is what I think extremist groups seek. Not so much the specific casualties, but the fallout from that, the fear and uncertainty that's generated when these events take place and they're not responded to in a way that makes people comfortable. So given that terrorism and extremism aims to affect us internationally, it sort of goes without saying that in order to be successful in combating terrorism and violent extremism, we have to have international cooperative structures in place to identify these organizations, to identify their leadership and their aims, to be able to cut off funding and supplies and support to them, to be able to stem the flow of new recruits. We also have to recognize that most terrorist activity, most extremist activity starts with an idea. It starts it starts in someone's head. And while it is necessary, and as someone who wore a military uniform for 20 years, I'm a firm believer in an appropriate military response, you can't defeat an idea with tanks and guns. I mean, it just, I know there are a few of my former colleagues in uniform who don't like hearing that, but there is no military powerful enough to defeat an idea. You can kill the people who hold that idea, but unless you can stop them getting new recruits, you keep killing until you run out of bullets, and you still got a war on your hands. And so What's needed is some way to understand the idea or ideas that undergird these extremist movements, and then to develop an appropriate mix of ways to deal with it. And that's where diplomacy comes in. During my time in the Army, I remember a saying, know your enemy, which sort of fit with something that my grandmother and my uncle taught me, is keep your friends close and hug your enemies like a python. Diplomacy is how we keep our friends close so that we can build the structures we need to provide mutual benefit and protection. But it's also a way that we can keep track of our adversaries. There are very few countries on the planet that we do not have some form of diplomatic relations with. And contrary to what the popular media, the image the popular media gives you of diplomats, we do not spend all of our time going to cocktail receptions and playing tennis with the prime minister. I can tell you that our diplomats at our embassy in Moscow are not having a good time. But despite what you might hear in some quarters, the Russians are not our friends. And because of that, it is very important that we have someone close to be able to test the wind, to keep a finger in the wind, to know which way it's blowing. If you have an adversary who you do not talk to, who you only encounter during times of conflict, you have an adversary who's gonna kidney punch you in the dark. So that's where diplomacy is important. Even in employing the military, it's also critical to have diplomatic support. I mean, you see I don't know how many of you have seen this new TV show. It's a couple of years old now, Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, which I had to stop watching because it's so unreal. It's about an FBI unit that gets jetted all over the world when an American gets in trouble, and they basically shoot in and shoot the place up and get the bad guys, and they get our people home. The FBI does have international response units. I've worked with them, but they do not have the carte blanche authority that these guys exercise on TV. And oh, by the way, our embassies are not in some of the places they show them to be in their movies. I think that threw me off when they had the embassy in Belize in some resort town, and had the ambassador meeting them on the tarmac when they landed. I mean, I was an ambassador twice, and I did not go out to the airport to meet FBI teams. That's what you have an RSO or a LEGAT for. But the point I make is this. If even when you are employing military or law enforcement assets as a terrorist response, there's a diplomatic component, and it seldom gets advertised. It certainly doesn't make it into the movies. In the movies, the guys put their parachutes on and they lock and load and they get on a plane, they jump out at the other end, they shoot up the bad guys and go home. What's left out? Somebody has to get flight and landing clearance for them. Someone has to get overflight permission for every sovereign country whose airspace that aircraft intrudes upon. Unless we're declaring war on a country, we do not land military forces in that country to do anything without its permission from the political leadership. And the military is not authorized, equipped, or trained to get such permission. By law, that's a diplomatic function. So even when you use the military, you need to have some diplomacy to enable the military to do its job. And who do you think, by the way, when a military team goes in on a counterterrorism response and does its job and gets on a plane and flies back to wherever they're based, who do you think cleans up the mess? And they inevitably leave a mess. Example, and not quite talking terrorism here, non-combatant evacuations. When a country's going to hell in a handbasket and the military comes in at State Department request and under State Department jurisdiction and evacuates American citizens, and they will usually use neighboring countries, provided that the circumstances in those countries are stable enough to do it, as staging bases to get Americans out, get them on commercial aircraft and back to the U.S. And when they do that, and they go home. And having been involved in a few of these in my 30 years in the Department of State, there's usually about a 6 to 8 month cleanup after they leave. They break things, they ruffle feathers, they do what the military's trained to do. I had a helicopter unit commander on an evacuation in West Africa once who wanted to let his pilots have a little strafing training along the coast of one of the countries, since they were just waiting for the cargo helicopters to bring in the evacuees to get. They didn't need the gunships to do it, and so rather than have his guys sit around, let them fly around and shoot up the coastline on a few countries to get some practice. That's what the military's trained to do, and without a diplomat on the scene to tell him not no, but hell no, I hate to think what might have happened. I could go on, but the point I'm making is that in order to effectively deal with, to combat terrorist activity, much as we do in regular military operations, for the military aspect of it, you need diplomacy before to create the conditions, get the permissions. You need diplomacy during. You don't have a diplomat on the team when they're breaking into a building to rescue hostages, but you better have one at the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to see that all of these coordinations done. And you definitely need one after to clean up the aftermath of any military action. You need diplomacy to create the cooperative agreements internationally to identify and track terrorist organizations, to understand their motivations, to try and, if not stop, at least stem their recruiting, and to shortcut their funding and other logistic support. And that, I would hope, gives you food for thought, for questions and comments, is why I think, contrary to what might seem logical, I think diplomacy is probably not necessarily but one of the most potent tools in our toolbox for combating violent extremism and terrorism, if only we're wise enough to use it appropriately in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opening remarks. We'll get back to you. Don't worry, don't go away. Okay. Go ahead.
I'd like to build a little bit on what Charlie Ray has been talking about and take this discussion to some personal observations about diplomacy and the functions of diplomacy and the practice of diplomacy in managing conflict, including terrorism, transnational terrorism, violent extremism. The first experience that I'd like to draw on was from serving in Beirut, Lebanon. I was there from June of 1983 until September of 1984, so nicely bookmarked by the first bombing that blew up our embassy and the second bombing that blew up our embassy again. That was a very different situation and a very different environment with very different drivers and motivators of those who were attacking us than was the case a few years later when I was ambassador in Mauritania. In the first instance, you have to consider the context that Lebanon had been for many years in a state of civil war. the United States was invited to send military presence to Beirut in the summer of after the summer of 1982, to help secure, first of all, the departure of the PLO forces from Beirut to their new home in Tunis, and second, to help secure, stabilize the situation on the ground. The invasion of Lebanon by Israel further destabilized that civil war, and I think one of the real game changers in that conflict was the massacre of Palestinians at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, primarily carried out by the Christian militias who were on the other side of the civil war. And it was a diplomat. It was the head of the political section, a gentleman named Ryan Crocker, who was the first one to go in after those massacres and to report on what had happened. As the Civil War continued, and we, the United States, became increasingly perceived by some factions in that Civil War as having taken sides. And whether we did or not, and I do not think we did, the perception was that we had taken sides in a civil conflict. And the result was, first, our embassy blown up on April 18, 1983, with, 60, 70 casualties, including 17 or 18 Americans, followed by the attack on the Marine Corps headquarters out at Beirut Airport, which I think is still one of the largest non-nuclear explosions that we've ever recorded. It had 241 casualties. It blew me out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was several miles away. And then our embassy blown up again in September of 1984. In those cases, those who would do us ill were still fairly conventional, if I may say, in terms of sponsorship, ideology, organization, affiliation. We know that Iran was and remains an active supporter, funder, recruiter for Hezbollah, which broke away from the more mainstream, if you will, Muslim combatants in Lebanon's civil war. And that was an environment that was fairly straightforward, I hate to say it, but fairly straightforward to navigate. We kind of understood who the bad guys were. We understood why they were motivated to do what they were doing. We understood where the funding was coming from. We knew a lot about them. In Mauritania, in 2010 to 2013, the situation on the ground was very different. No, there was no active civil war, but AQIM moved freely across very porous borders. They controlled a lot of the landscape because nobody else did. And so AQIM, which had no real statal backing, this is not state-sponsored terrorism in quite the same way that I think I would consider Hezbollah state-sponsored. But AQIM had and has its own agenda, not necessarily a single ideology, not necessarily a single party line, multiple sources of funding and support, and really reliant on the fact that there is very little in that North African Sahel landscape to inhibit their movement, their activities, their recruiting. In fact, most of the AQIM recruits are, I think, less motivated by ideology than they are by lack of other opportunity. And as Ambassador Ray has said, diplomacy and we, the people, the mission in country, have a responsibility to analyze, to understand, to support, to work with our military contacts, to work with our host government, to try to address the drivers of terrorism. What makes a recruit recruitable? How can we change that course? How can we make it difficult for AQIM to move across national boundaries that are weakly guarded or not guarded at all? How do we instill in the population of the country some notion that AQIM is not their friend either? Maybe not ours, but not theirs either. How do we build local police and military capacity? How do we build local civil capacity? How do we support efforts that will give disenfranchised youth opportunities to do something other than engage in petty criminality and the occasional kidnap for large ransoms? There are as many kinds of terrorism as you can imagine, and as many ideologies and as many drivers. And the things, we can't treat it monolithically. We have to understand what it is about this specific group or this specific organization. And I think being a diplomat, being on the ground in the environment, understanding the environment, is a key to understanding and developing an appropriate response. And I think that as diplomats, we have some incredible tools at our disposal to do that. The ambassador is the president's personal representative to whatever country the ambassador is accredited to. The ambassador leads a country team that may include, as Ambassador Ray alluded, many government agencies, including the FBI, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, the intelligence community, the Defense Department. And the ambassador controls this pool of incredible resources to draw on, and incredible talent and knowledge and experiences and expertise to analyze the why, the drivers, and to develop the appropriate, if not solutions, responses, whether that is inhibiting recruitment, cutting supply lines, creating an unfriendly environment for terrorists to operate in. Just making the ground harder to operate in can be incredibly effective. Another thing that we have, another tool that we have at our disposal, and one of the most important, I think, probably the single most effective, is our own men and women. The people who go out there, who establish contacts, who meet with people across a spectrum of backgrounds and activities, and who get to know, who engage, who participate in programs, who reach out to young people. In Mauritania, we had a series of film classes, and we invited young Mauritanians to make films about things that were important to them, and we paid for this, and we worked with a local organization to do this. Nobody told them what to make films about, but some of their short films were very revealing telling us what motivated young Mauritanians to go to an extreme, to be attracted to an extremist organization. Education is one of the areas where we can do more, should do more. I hope we will do more. Exchange programs. Nothing. A picture, tells so much more than words do. And the experience of being somewhere, of being in a different culture, of learning and experiencing something firsthand. These are some of the tools that are available to us that we can use to try to address the ideologies that drive terrorism, the despair and economic disenfranchisement that particularly attracts young people, the mythologies that people like Baghdadi use to attract recruits, and to make the ground, the environment inhospitable. These are all some of the things that we as diplomats can do, and we have to adapt because, as I started out, the situation in Lebanon was nothing like the situation in Mauritania a few years later, and yet we were confronting, combating terrorism and violent extremism in both countries. Very different ways, very different scenarios, very different circumstances. So these are some of the things that we can do as diplomats. We need that presence. We need that understanding. We need to know what drives why. We need to know how the supply lines work, where the money's coming from, so that we can stop that. There is a time and there is a place and there is a necessity for military intervention. And believe me, in Mauritania, the Africa Command was a frequent and welcome visitor because they had resources to train, to equip, to help us build civil capacity in a country that had very little in the way of civil society and almost nothing in the way of national identity. I think I'll stop there. I hope that's given you a few things to think about.
Thank you very much. Obviously, it triggered a lot of issues and questions, both of you. If I may take the liberty as moderator to ask both of you a question, perhaps General Gray would like to jump in at this stage as well. How do you respond to the historical, at least, record? I always look at history to see if we can learn anything. Going back to the 18th century, Frederick the Great, famously he mentioned that diplomacy without force is like music without instruments, and talking about realism. And then, of course, we know what many of the other leaders thought about diplomacy. For example, Teddy Roosevelt basically had the same concept and approach that you need the military in order to beef up the diplomatic. And then, of course, we come to the idealism approach of Woodrow Wilson, the 14 points, that he said that the peace agreements or processes obviously have to be open, and the public has to be aware of what's going on. So, in other words, you have basically, traditionally, historically, the two approaches of realism and idealism. And then, most recently, President Trump developed, at least in his foreign trip, an ecumenical diplomatic move when he went to Saudi Arabia, when he went to Israel, when he went to Rome, in terms of the role of religion. So my question to both of you, how do you see the role of diplomacy? And then, of course, you mentioned the experience in Lebanon in the early 1980s, and perhaps the general would like to deal with that particular aspect. So, again, in terms of those who are members of the diplomatic community and mission, but military people, the Marines, the Army, the Airmen, and so on, they were also obviously the victims of terrorism. So again, this is the question. In terms of the different perceptions of diplomacy, and obviously we do have the record open in terms of what scholars and leaders and professionals thought about that. What's your view?
Could I take advantage of my
Of course.
advanced age?
Of course.
Yeah, I guess in response to that, I would start with sort of going back to if diplomacy without force is like music without instruments. Force without diplomacy is like gang violence. My feeling on that is that there's a tendency to get too far out on either wing of that, all diplomacy, all force, when in fact neither works. I think Wilson's 14 points of, peace in our times or whatever, was naive in the extreme. But the idea that we can achieve all of our aims by force alone is equally foolish, because unless your aim is to go into a country, completely occupy it, and enslave its occupants, there has to be some mechanism to deal with the people in that country after the shooting stops, unless you plan for the shooting to never stop. I would give an example of how diplomacy is important in ways that are sometimes not appreciated. When I went to Cambodia in 2002, one segment of the Cambodian population that I think at the time, and I'm not saying this to brag because it just is, the Cham of Cambodia, which is very small, they're roughly 10-12% of the population, and probably 80% of the Cham are Muslim. The rest are animists or Buddhists. And I think I might have been the only person in the Department of State aware that the Cham were Muslims, and I knew that because I'd worked with them during my tours in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and unfortunately I was part of the planning group that caused the destruction of many of their villages when we backed the South Vietnamese incursion into Cambodia. No one back here seemed to be aware of this population, the fact that it one was Muslim, a particularly benign form of what I call Muslim with a Buddhist bent. At the time I arrived in 2002, we had no aid programs in our embassy, with very large aid targeted at this group. Very few of the staff of my embassy were even aware of their existence. When we started talking to the Cham, we discovered that the Jemaah Islamiyah group out of Indonesia, as surrogates of the Saudi Wahhabi, were in fact sending imams into Cambodia, into Cham villages, and they were hell-bent on radicalizing the Cham population. Had succeeded in some villages to the point where among the Cham who had been easygoing, as I said, sort of Buddhist Muslims, had built separate mosques. Those who were following J.I. would not go to mosque with the others. They were literally breaking these villages, segmenting these villages, which was troubling because this is in the wake of 9/11, and we were doing Muslim outreach programs all over the world. We didn't have one in Cambodia because no one back here knew that there was a Muslim population to reach out to. And in those of you who've ever had to work in government organizations know, once it gets underway, getting it changed is like changing the direction of an aircraft carrier. You can spin that wheel all you want to, but you'll have had 2 cups of coffee before the bow starts to move. We managed, though, finally to finesse it. We had a congressman in California who was very much interested in education, who had come out to Cambodia, and I had gotten him a ride on an elephant, and he was just absolutely tickled pink, and he went back to Washington, and he put $2 million in the State Department budget earmarked for the embassy in Cambodia for educational programs. I'm not saying it was the elephant alone that did it. He saw a need for it. We were able, after some negotiations with aid, to get about $75,000 of that $2 million carved out, which I put into programs specifically for young CHUM students for English language training and for college prep training to try and pull them up on a par with the Khmer students in applying for scholarships to foreign schools. And I went to several ceremonies in CHUM villages. I was an honored guest for 3,000 CHUM who lined up in a soccer field to welcome me to a fishing village one day, and didn't really think a lot of it until about 11 or 12 months later. A French anthropologist who had been studying the CHUM for some university in France came to the embassy wanting to know what the hell we'd done to change her, to screw up her study. because she'd been studying these people for a few years, and you know, in an attitudinal study, they'd ranked countries, and to the CHUM for the longest time, I mean, the U.S., we had about a 12% approval rating among the CHUM. Had nothing to do with religion, had to do with the fact that they remembered who bombed their villages back in the 70s. And they also were aware that we were giving lots of money to a lot of organizations in Cambodia for a lot of things, and none of it was trickling down to them. So this $75,000 scholarship program, which to me seemed like just the basic minimum, was so welcomed in the community, and they are a very tight-knit community that this anthropologist informed us that in a period of about 4 months, her statistics had done this giant flop from 12% approval to something like 84% approval, because suddenly they realized that, well, the Americans had discovered them, and this was giving them something they sorely needed. Put a big monkey wrench into Jamaat Islamiya's radicalization program, which wasn't our intent, because at that point we really didn't know that much about it. And I tell this to say, it's the smallest things. It's not, if you're looking at things in terms of black and white, it's either use the military or use diplomacy. You're usually gonna be wrong. You have to look at the specific situation and then tailor the response, the package, the program, the team to that situation, to that village, to that community or neighborhood at that time. And the only people who are in a position to be able to do that effectively are the people who are there day in and day out dealing with these people, our diplomats, and not just our State Department diplomats. What I call my outreach response team in Cambodia consisted of my defense attaché, the head of my military, Office of Military, the guys who handle the training.
Cooperation, OMC.
Yeah, that a PAO, and the number 2 in the CDC. I had a Centers for Disease Control. I didn't have my political guy on it. I didn't have my consular guy on it. I had my admin guy on it to provide support. That was my response team under my direct control. And we did things that caused a few eyebrows to lift back here in Washington, but they were effective. There was a Jamaat Islamiyah 8-month mission surveilling the American and British embassies in Phnom Penh, which we found out after a riot threw a monkey wrench in their plans to blow us up. That failed because they couldn't get a Cham Muslim to volunteer to help them get the explosives and get them put in the right place. So, and I make that point because it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a do it this way or do it that way situation. It is and again, the argument for the diplomatic participation, it is your response to a situation must fit that situation. And it must fit that situation at that time. What I did with the Cham in 2003 probably wouldn't work today. I mean, to consider, I gave them something when they'd been getting absolutely nothing. Now that they've gotten something, try giving them that puny a package now, and they'll probably laugh you out of their villages. So you need people on the ground aware of the circumstances and in contact with not just the people, but also the environment to work these programs effectively. And that, I guess that, my response to that is, Wilson's diplomacy only, and who was that guy, Frederick the Great or whatever?
The Great.
Or Teddy Roosevelt's, hit him with your big stick. It might give you a certain amount of pleasure to do that, but, it's ultimately it's just going to screw things up worse. Sorry, that's not a politically correct answer. But I don't believe in being extreme. It's. I mean, in Buddhism, you hear talk about finding the middle path, the middle way, and while that's, it sounds philosophical, the fact is that in diplomacy, quite often the most successful way is somewhere approaching the middle. You're balancing factors. Unlike a military operation that's go out, do your mission, complete your mission, go home. Diplomacy, we never get to go home because our mission's never done.
Would you
Absolutely.
like to make a quick comment? Then
A
we'll
quick
open it
comment
up.
on that. There's a lot of debate about soft power and hard power, and the truth is it takes both. They complement, they are complementary, and any president executing foreign policy, any Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense executing and developing foreign policy recognizes that. A small example in Mauritania, I mentioned that AFRICOM was a frequent visitor and one of my best friends. One of AFRICOM's functions was to train the Mauritanian military, train and equip. We sold them airplanes because they have a vast, vast territory that is very thinly populated. But another thing that the military did for us was send in humanitarian assistance teams. They sent in veterinarians to work with local herders to treat livestock, to have healthier livestock, more new births, more milk, more food. Can't tell you how important that was to helping make the population a little more stable, a little more food secure. So hard and soft power work together, and it isn't so neatly divided that diplomacy is only soft power, and I would say that diplomacy is very hard work indeed. And the military is not exclusively hard power. It can be both, and it takes both, and they complement each other.
Right. Yeah, okay. We would like to open it up for discussion. It's okay. Obviously, the debate goes on, and in a very limited, modest way, working at the UN, going all the way back. I was obviously influenced by the diplomatic missions and the wise, I think, observations of some of the leaders. Obviously, I will share it with you. I mean, I wrote it all the way back. But at any rate, I would like to open it up for discussion, as we indicated, to encourage those who are diplomats, if they want to jump into it, professionals, academics, and again, as General Gray indicated, we can learn from the next generation, our students, to take the opportunity to actually develop some sort of give and take with people who have that very rich background. Anyone first? I would appreciate, Sharon, if somebody could get the mic over there. And just for the record, to identify yourself and your question or shortcoming, not speeches.
Professor Yonah, thank you very much. General Gray, Ambassador Ray, and Ambassador Powell, thank you for your service. One of the things that is obvious is that as problem solvers in the military and the diplomatic service, you have to deal with paradox. So, Ambassador Powell, when you spoke about, no, I'm sorry, Ambassador Ray, when you spoke about the insertion of Wahhabist ideology into Cambodia, what were the correspondences within the State Department in terms of how we might constructively engage the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in terms of communicating the complexity and the problems that they were causing for international security in terms of supporting such extreme ideology?
Well, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the State Department and how it's structured, but picture the Balkan states. The bureau in the State Department that deals with Saudi Arabia and the bureau in the State Department that deals with East Asia, Cambodia, although they are roughly on the same floor or about as far apart in day-to-day coordination as these regions of the world are physically on the ground. And so, while as an ambassador it was actually easier for me to communicate with the Department of Defense than it was to communicate with the Assistant Secretary for what's it called, NEA? It's just so, I mean, I spent 30 years in the State Department. I'm not even sure what their acronym stands for. The East Asia Bureau was, of course, made aware of our findings, and the cables reporting them are in the State Department's great data bank of reporting cables, properly tagged and identified. Whether or not anyone who deals directly with the Saudis ever read, thought about, or responded to or reacted to those cables in any way, I was never made aware of such. And of course, my communications with those people in the department in the East Asia Pacific Bureau were confined to what we were doing and could do on the ground with our interlocutors, which is sort of it's a long answer to say I haven't a clue if we have ever talked to. I mean, my guess would be from just reading the newspapers and knowing the dynamics of the U.S.-Saudi relationship that we really haven't. That what was done. I go back even farther than that. In 1993, I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Freetown, Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone is a country that's about 60% Muslim, about 39% Christian and about 1% who knows. Again, like the Cham in Cambodia, Sierra Leonean Muslims are pretty easygoing. The Saudis were funding Egyptian imams to reach out to the Sierra Leonean Muslim communities, and this was because the Saudi imams wouldn't go into Sierra Leonean villages because of just the culture. I mean, this is in the 90s, and you would have the market ladies going to work wearing just skirts, and that just scandalized the Saudis. And so, but did we ever engage the Saudis on this type of behavior? I doubt it. I certainly didn't. I mean, then I was answering to the Africa Bureau. Did the Africa Bureau communicate with the bureau covering the Middle East? I don't know. I doubt it. So it's not so much a paradox as it is just a bureaucratic reality that within the Department of State, people, up until the time I retired in 2012, I can't say that that's true now, but people tended to pretty much concern themselves almost exclusively with their small patch, and getting it's difficult enough to get programs going that involve groups of embassies within the same bureau.
In the intelligence community, we call that problems with silos.
Yes.
And
We have silos, and big time in the Department of State. The silos there are.
Is there an effort to integrate operations and?
We have had over the years any number of times we've had they use the buzzwords of regionalization and encouraging ambassadors to reach out to their embassies in their region. The problem is that it's never really backed up with resources. You never really get in a bureaucracy, that which gets rewarded gets done. We've not had many ambassadors that I know of who were promoted or given an award for creating a regional program at their embassy. I mean, and so some do it, and there's a half-hearted effort, but I never saw a real solid, concentrated effort to get regional programs going. The closest I ever came to it was when I was ambassador to Zimbabwe. We had the Friends of Zimbabwe, which was EU, U.S., Japan embassies and aid programs would get together twice a year and discuss how bad things were in Zimbabwe and why we couldn't make them better. Sorry.
Okay, we have some more questions. Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Norman Segar here from the Potomac Institute. In the assumed shrinkage of the State Department, both in terms of material resources and perhaps even roles, how does one compensate for that? And what's the impact, first of all, on counterterrorism, and how does one compensate for that dynamic?
Well, a timely question, because the reorganization and examination of what are the core functions of the Department of State are very much the topic of the moment in the State Department today. I just finished an assignment as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Resources, so I've been talking all reorg all the time for the last 6 months. The impact on the department's ability to carry out its function remains to be seen. The Secretary has not yet decided what his reorganization exactly is going to look like. I think we who have been a part of this dialogue are very focused on maintaining our core presence, our core missions overseas, because that is the pointy end of our spear. As far as programs like counterterrorism go, as you know, a 30% cut to the State Department's budget for 2018 is going to have a significant impact on program activities, programs that are important in any ambassador's toolkit. They are useful, they are important, but they are not the critical element. The critical element of the Department of State is its people. And I think that whatever shape a reorganization takes and whatever the result is in terms of the size and structure of the workforce, I am pretty confident that our missions overseas and our core functions overseas are going to remain as robustly staffed as we can manage. It is much, much easier to shut down a program and start it back up again a few years later than it is to cut off a pipeline of staff, of officers, of foreign service professionals. If you cut that off and try to start it 2 or 3 years later, you have left yourself a hole that will take many, many years to repair. So, these are decisions that I know the Secretary and his leadership team are studying closely now. And I wish them luck because it's not going to be easy.
Yes, right there.
Hi, I'm Milton Honig. I have 2 items. One, it seems to me that any attempt at diplomacy would have completely interfered with our attack on Osama bin Laden and his killing in Pakistan. Anything that would have informed the Pakistanis about that beforehand would have completely aborted the entire activity. Second point is, before we go to war with Iran, maybe it's time to reopen our embassy there. We haven't been there since 1979. Is there any? Maybe that should have been a point in the JCPOA, the final item. Anyway, maybe is that a worthwhile thing to consider, reopening our embassy in Tehran?
Well, I would go to your first one. I totally agree. I mean, I don't think any diplomat with his head in the air would suggest that we, on the eve of launching an operation against Osama bin Laden, that the diplomats go in and inform the Pakistanis in advance. As I said, each situation, there's no template. Okay, we're gonna go after bin Laden. Okay, we first have to do no. That checklist is going to be different for every operation, and so that kind of an operation, I mean, you don't inform the host government. However, I will say this: if you have created the right diplomatic environment, and again, you're looking at it from a military standpoint. What do we do for this particular operation? In diplomacy, it's what do we do to create the environment so these types of operations can be conducted appropriately when they come up, and that's where diplomacy fits there. If we have the right diplomatic relationship with the Pakistanis, then the process of planning and executing that operation is less fraught with unknowns and uncertainty. And of course, the aftermath, when we do have to go in after liftoff, is less traumatic when we go in and say, oh, by the way, here's what we just did. We have some countries where we can do that, and we can do it quite successfully, but then we have others not. On having an embassy in Iran. My secretary in Cambodia was one of the hostages in Iran, and this is. She became my secretary in 2002. Still traumatized by that experience, but a very, very bright, very thoughtful person whose point was, from her perspective as the ambassador to the deputy chief of mission in that embassy during that time. Proper diplomacy before the embassy takeover could probably have, if not prevented it, at least mitigated some of the way it was done, and that to let that incident long after the fact prevent us from somehow establishing effective contacts, if not with certain players in the Iranian government, but the Iranian people, make no sense. So I guess my sense is, again, going back to what I said about keep your friends close, but when it comes to your enemies, be a python. If we want to be able to have any impact on what the Iranians do in that region and the world, we need to be close enough to them to know what that is in time, and diplomatic relations is how you do that. If you only had diplomatic relations with the people that you liked all the time, then we could cut the State Department 30% because we wouldn't have a whole lot of embassies. So, yeah, I think whether we could do it right now under current circumstances, a political reality, probably not, because of the process needed to do it. Whether it's a good idea to think about, it's like Cuba. We were not talking to Cuba long past the time when it made any sense not to talk to them. It was almost like, well, we've not talked to them, and so we won't talk to the people we don't talk to. I mean, that makes sense?
If I could just add, reestablishing diplomatic relations and reestablishing an embassy in Tehran would first and foremost require the full cooperation and support of the Iranians.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we have that. So this is not something that we can impose. We, I think, have, under Secretary Kerry, taken a pretty important step in reestablishing at least a conversation with the Iranians. That's a good first step. And I think if we can continue to build on that in multilateral fora, for example, with third-party support, whether it's the Swiss or the Swedes or anybody else, then we should absolutely continue that discussion. I was last in Iran just a few years before the takeover. I think my father was posted there, and he left in 1972, 3, something like that. So I spent some time in Iran, and I think that most Iranians, probably would not be taking to the streets if we were to discuss with the Iranian government reestablishing relations and reopening an embassy. But we've got to get that support first, and that I don't think we're there yet either.
And I also point out that it's not we wake up one day and say we're going to have diplomatic relations with Iran, and suddenly the newspapers are full of it. I would point out that Vietnam and China, 2 countries that we currently have full diplomatic relations with, there was a long period where we talked for about how, where we should go before we even went so far as take the step of establishing a liaison office, which is for the first step in establishing an embassy and full diplomatic relations. I think that's probably where we are with Iran. We're in the courtship phase where we get to know each other, where we start to feel them out as to what their views are. And because I agree with what Ambassador Powell said. It's not that we wake up and we decide we want relations with Iran and snap our fingers and we get it. We need to know what they want and what's in it for them. And this is, again, where diplomacy comes in. When I use the word diplomacy, I don't necessarily mean formal diplomatic relations with embassies. Diplomacy is the process of communicating with others and establishing channels of communications to get mutually beneficial things done. And it doesn't always require having this whole formal exchange of diplomatic papers. It requires having an exchange of ideas.
Can I ask you just a question again, and we'll come back on this issue. We fully understand the mission, I think, of diplomats and the role and the tools and all that. Can I ask you a political question? In other words, who makes a decision on a particular approach? For example, we have now the crisis, the Qatar crisis in Saudi Arabia and the rest of it. Is this the role of the State Department? Is it the role of the White House? Is it a combination? Is it the dialogue between state and the White House? So in other words, just for our young people here, particularly the students, I mean, as you say, it's not either or, but now so much in the news, there are sort of conflicting, I think, ideas that's coming from the White House and the State Department, and people are confused. Can you provide some clarity?
Not much clarification. I can confirm that there's a lot of confusion out there. And policy, policy rarely resides in the hands of one organization or entity. The Department of State has an important role in the formulation of policy and in the execution of policy. But the NSC also has an important role in the formulation of policy. The Defense Department has a role. The intelligence community has a role. The White House, obviously, is where it all comes together. And, every president, not just this one, has relied on both formal advisors in the formal structures of government as well as more informal advisors. Everybody, as an ambassador, I had a network back in the department in Washington in the Africa Bureau. But I also had some sort of informal litmus test people whose ideas I respected and whose thinking I respected that I could sort of reach out to informally. Every one of these functions is legitimate and defensible, and the ultimate decision maker is the president. But the State Department may have the leading role in one aspect and not in another. I personally think that the debate is healthy. I think that it is to everybody's benefit to hear as many points of view as possible before going forward. But it's a process that it's dynamic. Not every policy, not every decision is going to have the same inputs. It's going to change from one issue to another.
I'll throw a real soft apple into this and say it depends. It depends on the country and whether or not that country is of sufficient strategic importance to us that it gets continued high-level interest. And it depends on the issue. There are some issues that will always be decided at no less than the assistant secretary, deputy secretary, secretary level. There are other issues that will always go to the NSC and be briefed to the president before they're decided. There are, however, other issues that are in effect policies that will actually, in terms of what's done and how it's carried out, will be decided even at the level of ambassador. Mm-hmm. If it's of low strategic importance and no one here really cares about it, and you do it, and no one sends you a blistering cable saying get on the next plane and come back and bring all your household effects with you because you're fired, then you've made policy. And it's the ultimate responsibility and authority for foreign policy resides with the president. The actual sort of day-to-day policy guru is the Secretary of State, but the mandarins who carry it out are generally the assistant secretaries. That's the quote senior policy level. But the reality is, I was trying to think of an example. I'll give you an example, and I go back to Cambodia but that was a laboratory of how to get your rear end chewed and still survive it. When we discovered that there had been this Jemaah Islamiyah activity aimed at the British and U.S. embassies, what we discovered at the same time was that because of a certain State Department reluctance to incur the wrath of some people in Congress who didn't like the Prime Minister, that they were restricting the programs and contacts that we could have with the Cambodian military and with the Cambodian police, who, by the way, were responsible for border security and internal security, who are the ones who would know about possible surveillance and other activities. But I was informed after my station chief came in and said, by the way, here's an intercept I want you to read, and I find out that these two guys had been drawing maps and planning where to put the bombs on both my embassy and the British embassy for 8 months. Well, going to the State Department and saying we have to change this policy, you got to let me talk to the military because we're in danger not to, was a non-starter because they'd already decided that protecting the bigger budget was more important than running into a fight. So I did something that ambassadors are authorized to do, but only do in extremis. I wrote a telegram from me directly to the Secretary of Defense. I let the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary, and the Assistant Secretary know what I was doing, and I outlined the problems and the vulnerabilities, and I strongly suggested that he get on the phone and call the commander of Pacific Command and point out that they needed to have a more robust dialogue with the Cambodians to be able to provide effective counterterrorism support. I also talked to the commander of Pacific Command before I did this, so he was on board. Needless to say, there were people within the state bureaucracy who objected to this because this was changing a policy or trying to affect a change in policy without involving them. And I didn't involve them because they didn't really want to be involved. Ultimately, the policy was changed because the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the Deputy Secretary of State, and the Assistant Secretary for East Asian Pacific Affairs agreed with me over the bureaucracy. So in effect, I made a policy, which was then endorsed. And that happens. It in many ways, large and small, on a day-to-day basis, people who really aren't, quote, technically policymakers will make policy by the actions they take if those actions are not refuted. Okay, and so I mean, that's the reality of the policy-making sausage mill. Is you have certain policies that the president himself must sign off on. You have other policies where the Secretary of State must sign off on, and it goes on. And you have other issues that are in effect little policies that, as long as they don't gore anyone's ox, they're done on the ground. And so, you know, that's how it's done. And there is no, you can't really describe. I mean, you can academically describe policy making in Washington, but it would take a 6-week seminar to describe the reality of policy making in this town. It really would.
That's
Ambassador,
ambitious.
Can I cannot resist but to ask you, in the news just recently, the report about the most senior diplomat in China who resigned after almost 30 years,
Yeah.
because he felt that the president's policy
On
on the
climate.
On climate
Paris
change.
agreement was completely wrong. He wrote an op-ed. You probably saw it in the paper. He was interviewed. So the question, aside from the I think agency relationship and input, as you describe it so well, within the State Department, if you are an ambassador or a foreign service, whatever official, you don't like a particular policy. You mentioned in the extreme maybe, but can you say, look, I mean, you president are wrong, and I'm not prepared to serve under your command.
You always have the option to resign, and in fact, if going back, when you join the Foreign Service, you sign an agreement that you will be, one, available for worldwide assignment, and two, that you will faithfully carry out the policies made by those above you to the best of your ability. If you, and this has, this is just government service or military service for that matter, writ large, and I'm sure General Gray will agree, if you cannot carry out an order that you're given, the only honorable thing to do is resign. Okay? I mean, if you know, this business of, well, you're going to stay and you're going to fight the bastards from the inside is just, that's most dishonorable. You resign if it is that. However, and this is something I have been wrestling with for the last 5 years. I just did a book a few months ago. I just published a book. It's called Ethical Dilemmas in the Practice of Diplomacy. And in it, I address this issue. What I feel is a real problem is not people acting unethically, not people breaking the law, breaking the rules, but people not being equipped sufficiently to handle situations where values collide, where my boss wants me to do something that conflicts with my personal value systems, or where the demands of my job conflict with my value systems, or, as many of us have faced, where two different bureaus of my organization want me to do
Different things.
different things that can't be done together, but both are right. And what thought process, what decision-making process do I use to decide between the two? Or my organization asks me to do something, which is fine, it's legal to do it, but it asks me to do it in a way that I feel is counterproductive. How do I engage with the system to get that job done but still preserve my integrity and my value systems? And unfortunately, the Department of State has a number of, quote, core value announcements that have come out over the years, and they teach ethics out at the Foreign Service Institute, although they teach compliance ethics, which is don't do this, don't do that, go to jail if you do this. What we do not have is a system, and the Army starting, and I'm sure the other services are considering it too, a system that teaches people how to deal with ethical dilemmas, how to deal with clash of values. What do you do? I mean, it's the old, I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's a test that they do in some universities. You're standing at a beside a railroad, and there are 5 workers down the track, and there's a little junction here, and there's 1 worker over there, and the train is coming, and the workers can't see the train, and the train driver can't see the workers, and you're standing near the switch. What do? Do you let the train hit the 5 workers, or do you switch it onto the track and hit the 1 worker? It's a silly problem, but it describes what we in government face on a daily basis. Is how do I decide between these 2 competing projects? What criteria do I use to rank them? You know, if I'm an ambassador in a country, and I was, and I've got an American in jail in a province, on trumped-up charges where the provincial governor just made an announcement saying he's going to do all these nasty things to NGOs at a time when we were really strong on supporting NGOs. Do I go to war with the governor over his statement about the NGOs, or do I keep quiet and try to get the American out of jail? Both of them are right things to do, but I can't do both. Because if I go after the governor, I'm really putting that American in jeopardy. And if I remain quiet, I'm basically sort of saying, you know, forget the NGOs, for now I'm working on this. And a decision has to be made. You've got to, this is one of those cases where the old bureaucratic, if I don't do anything, I won't get in trouble, won't work. You've got to pick one or two of those. Right. And we don't have a system to help people do that.
That's true. I just would like to add to what Ambassador Ray has said, that the worst thing you can do is to subvert your leadership. So ultimately, resignation may be the answer, but I would like to think, I believe that ours is a culture that permits, encourages discussion and debate. And we do have, and it is sacrosanct in the Department of State and in the Foreign Service, something called the dissent channel, which is a mechanism for individuals, officers, at any rank, at any level, to challenge a policy. The dissent channel is never used for administrative things, but it is used to challenge policy. And if if you're getting nowhere in your strong disagreement with a policy decision, the dissent channel is available, and it is used, and it is a protected communication. So
it's in the law.
It's in the law.
John, would you like to comment on that?
Are you done yet?
Oh, we have, okay, we will have another one or two, and take the mic, please.
My name is Süleyman Özeren. I am a research scholar at George Mason for now. And I have a very brief comment and two questions, especially for Ambassador Powell. As you mentioned, working with the NGOs and societies or organizations within countries really help to learn more about what is going on in those countries. From my personal experience, we got a grant from U.S. State Department in 2015 on a project, and the project was countering violent extremism through unraveling the propaganda and recruitment techniques of ISIS in Turkey. And basically the project that we conducted aims to learn about the radicalization trends in Turkey and how to deal with them. Of course, we conveyed the results to the embassy, and of course, naturally, they conveyed that to the State Department. But there is another problem, specifically for Turkey. There is an increasing anti-American sentiment, and unfortunately, this sentiment is backed by the media, which is also backed by the government. My question is, how can you create an alternative channel to reach out to the societies like Turkey? Because a couple of months ago, the percentage was like 87% anti-American sentiment, and it wasn't seen. I mean, this is unique. The second issue has to do with Syrian conflict, and as the American involvement will increase in the coming days and months, do you see any potential risk, in terms of the trend that you have experienced in Lebanon? U.S. has been taking sides in Syrian conflict for a long time, but not that on the ground level. So these are my questions.
Two very hard questions. I think I could probably talk for hours on either subject. To answer the second question first, is there risk? Absolutely. Absolutely. Diplomacy takes risks all of the time. And risk avoidance should not be part of our policy. Risk mitigation should always be, but not risk avoidance. So back to the comment I made about soft power being pretty hard nonetheless. It is true. Everything that we do, every hard problem that we try to solve, resolve, bring to a conclusion carries risk. Risk to our people, risk to our embassies, risk to embassies in other countries, perhaps even risks to populations here in the United States. Yes, but we have to assess risk, we have to understand what the challenges are, and we have to make a decision what level of risk we are willing to live with. How much, how tolerant are we going to be? And those judgments are going to vary from one situation to another. Is what we may decide to do in Syria risky? Of course. And I don't know what we're going to decide to do. But whatever we do decide to do, evaluation of risk and a discussion of how to mitigate it are going to be part of that discussion. As far as the situation in Turkey, a little personal note. My son, I only have one child, and he did his junior year abroad at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul a couple of years ago, and he's still studying Turkish, and he's getting to be a pretty good Turkish speaker. But we've all been watching what's been happening in Turkey because his presence there made it particularly interesting for all of us. And it is indeed unfortunate that anti-American sentiment seems to be on the rise. And how do we stay connected when there is a lot of, noise about anti-Americanism and the public sentiment is perhaps changing, or at least the official version is changing. I think in any society where media are controlled to some extent or another, in the absence of a truly free media, you just have to maintain those contacts on the ground at every level of civil society and keep that work going. And that is why diplomacy is on the ground is so essential. In Mauritania, the press was it was pretty open. It was also pretty irresponsible. and I spent a lot of time, chasing down and debunking stories that were just ridiculous. One of the most persistent ones was that we were running some secret prison in northern Mauritania. Well, nothing could have been farther from the truth. And yet this free press, and it was very free, also very irresponsible, just didn't believe in checking sources, didn't believe in, they hear something and boy, it would be all over the newspapers the next day. So managing the media is another challenge for diplomats. But in the absence of objective reporting and in the face of a growing anti-American sentiment that may be fueled in part by a government that disagrees with what we are doing in many ways for many reasons. I won't go into that, but I would say that at that point, the role of the diplomat and the contacts and the connections that the embassy and its diplomats have across the span of society, civil society, becomes more important than ever. And you maintain the contacts with the universities, you maintain the contacts with the business community, you maintain the contacts with the media and the press and the government at every level that you can, and you just keep those relationships thriving. And I think it's not a fast process.
Okay, Ambassador.
But there's the other is that, and this is something that we're still in government, I think, really wrestling with, and that is maintaining a dialogue, if you will, or contact with the populations of these countries primarily through social media. Social media employment is something that the government came to late. The State Department, as it usually does, came to later than the rest of the government. And when I retired in 2012, was still wrestling with what kind of social media policy should we have. And I will just give anecdotes of how I saw it employed and how I myself employed it during that time in Zimbabwe, where the government you had a government-controlled media that was 80% propaganda, unless it was the sports section. You had some, quote, independent media that was 95% irresponsible, and not a lot in between other than the rumor mill. And you had a government that was determined to control as much as it could the flow of information to the people, especially the young people. We couldn't rely on any of the media, in fact, to get the message out, because, as I said, the government media spun everything for propaganda, and the independent media just spun everything out of. You couldn't recognize things when they got through with it. I mean, to them, truth was a three-letter word. So we were faced with this problem of how do you, not so much get rid of this incorrect narrative, but how do you introduce an alternative narrative to the public for them to consider? And really, you can't control how people respond to the news they get. All you can do is try and provide them with the proper appropriate information. We actually, out of desperation, and because of the demographics, were forced to use social media. This is a country that not many people had access to computers, but everybody over the age of 14 had a mobile phone. And most of those mobile phones connected to the internet through satellites. So you had kids out in the countryside far away from the nearest electrical outlet, but with their battery-powered phone on Facebook and on YouTube. So we started doing live Facebook chats with Zimbabwean youngsters, and the government couldn't. How do you stop? They were coming off South African satellites, so the government couldn't block the transmissions. My public diplomacy section started accompanying me to all of my public appearances and live tweeting excerpts from my public remarks so that the government couldn't spin them another way, or the free press couldn't report them inaccurately, because there was on the internet where I had 7,000 Zimbabweans following my Facebook page, and I had the embassy Twitter account linked to my Facebook page, so our tweets were also appearing on my Facebook page. It made it more difficult for the propagandists in the government to spin a government-slanted story. And it forced the independent press to, at least in when it came to us, clean up their act and report more accurately. The other thing we did was, we were all over YouTube. When there would be an incident, I had a videographer in my public affairs section who could do a videotape and do subtitles and music, and have it uploaded within an hour of the end of an incident. And this guy, I used to call him Southern Africa's Cecil B. DeMille. He was fantastic, still is. And so we were constantly, there'd be a demonstration and the police would overreact, and we'd have a Suzanne Weza production with the pictures of a policeman whacking someone over the head with no drama, just straight reporting. This date in this place, this happened, and be a little background music to make it, nice for the kids to listen to. Needless to say, the government of Zimbabwe was happy when I left. The point I'm making there, though, is that, again, it is using the tools of diplomacy to help frame the narrative. Diplomacy can't catch a terrorist. Diplomacy couldn't kill Osama bin Laden. But diplomacy can help in pre-terrorist conditions. It can help to frame the narrative to have a more balanced dialogue. It can help to give people an alternative script to read from. In a lot of these countries, these kids, they're unemployed, underemployed, they're frustrated, they're angry, and when they take to the streets or they join these organizations, the information flowing into them is stovepiped, it's limited. They don't have anything to counter the BS that they're being fed. So it's up to diplomacy to look for a way to introduce a new channel of communication. And one that we still, I feel, don't use to its maximum utility is social media. You know, I see young faces here, and I'll be willing to bet you that the young faces back there, you get most of your news on social media. You don't watch Fox News, you don't watch CNN, you don't watch MSNBC. You get it off Yahoo News, link, whatever. And so if you want to communicate to that demographic, and you're writing op-eds for the local newspaper and long think pieces for Foreign Policy Magazine, they're not hearing you. You got to write a nice blog post or have a nice infographic on Instagram or on Facebook, and then you get your message across. You get and you got to engage in a dialogue. I used to spend from about 8 to 10 each evening at my residence in Zimbabwe answering questions on Facebook that I would get from young Zimbabweans, and I made it a point to answer them myself, which, again, I had the Minister of Youth Affairs used to see me and he'd come up and he's trying to take my job, he's like, because I would call a meeting or say I was going to give a speech and invite young people, and I would get 3 times the number of people show up at a venue that he would get, and it just drove him nuts. But the fact is, I was doing what their own government wasn't doing. I was responding to people personally. That's what diplomacy is all about, and that's what diplomats do routinely. I mean, and not often in such dramatic circumstances. But the fact is, that consular officer interviewing someone for a visa is conducting public diplomacy on our behalf. And we need to recognize and mobilize all of this in ways that contribute to a better understanding of extremist groups and a better framework to create a counter narrative to the one that they're pushing.
Thank you very much, General Gray. Getting close to
Close to the end, then.
well, not doing too
He
badly.
has decided.
Well, I want to thank both of our ambassadors for a very, very great discussion, a lot of keen insights and the like. And I just want to remind everybody that life is always not pessimistic. Within the State Department, within the Department of Defense, within the other cabinet leadership challenges, within the administration, within the country, there are a lot of good people, a lot of hard-working good people who know what the hell they're doing, and they're very good at what I call the art of getting things done, as opposed to the science of getting things done. And in terms of the art of getting things done, since time immemorial, there's been a great relationship between the State Department and the military. The State Department and the Marine Corps in particular has been very, very close. And for more years than the current crowd can remember, this has been going on. For example, in the 1940s and 50s, we had a Marine colonel named John Canton whose father worked in Morocco, and John, when he was young, had the privilege of teaching later the gentleman who became the king of Morocco, English. And so that relationship could not, that couldn't change. That was a relationship that was embedded forever. And every time in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when there was a problem with Morocco, and we had a few in those days, John Canton, wherever he was at, for example, in 1967, John was the G2 of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force in Da Nang in Vietnam. In the middle of the war, they yanked him right out of Da Nang and sent him to Morocco, and he solved the problem. So this kind of thing has been going on forever. And all of our commanders-in-chief of all of our unified commands, they're all 4-star admirals and generals. In their education, they've had a long list of educational opportunities to learn about diplomacy in the State Department, foreign affairs. In fact, all unified commanders are really ambassadors in green. Much of their trips to the foreign countries and the like, it's more diplomacy than it is military or anything else like that. And so we need to remember that. And you have connections. For example, many young foreign military people come to our schools, and those relationships that grow up in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Coast Guard, I mean, they're forever. For example, I can remember when I was sent to Korea in 1987 to work on some challenges. I was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Commandant at the time, and Mr. Weinberger wanted some things done. And I can remember they involved a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. And lo and behold, the ambassador to Indonesia had been a classmate of mine in school many years ago, so that made the problem much simpler. I have a particular relationship with Turkey because I was a young forward observer in the Korean War for the Turkish Brigade. And so that relationship, you know, you can't do away with that relationship. And I can remember going to see Ataturk in the monument, speaking there and the like. I can remember being asked by the State Department to go to Turkey because there was another recurring problem with the Turkish problem with that part of the world and the like. And so we do these kind of things, and we do them quietly and effectively, and we work together. And so don't leave here being too pessimistic. My colleagues really painted a pretty dismal scene about everybody, and it's not quite that bad as they know. I want to remind you that terrorism is a tactic, and there's no such thing as a global world against a tactic. These tactics have been around, has been pointed out by everyone here since forever, and they'll be around in the future. The great hope, of course, is that people realize it's not worth it, and that's the great thing that we have to strive to reach and the like. We also know the statement was made by Ambassador Ray. You know, and both really, that it's an international kind of a situation. We have to have an international structure, and that's important. And you need to remember that. And you young people need to remember that. We need to build these international relationships, and we need to keep them alive and well. I also heard mentioned in the brief about the relationship and the country team. This is vital for you young people to understand that we do have what we call a country team in this operation. It's made up of the intelligence community. It's made up of the military defense attachés. It's made up of the regional security officer. It's made up of the whole ambassadorial team. And the ambassador is in charge of the country, and we need to remember that. In terms of evacuations, I take exception to some of the dismal things you pointed out about evacuations, but I won't get into an argument here. I'll simply say that the leading capability for evacuations is the naval capability. The Navy and the Marines do most of the evacuations for obvious reasons, because when you're at sea and the like, it's like a rheostat. You can go, you don't have to land, you can pick your time and choosing. And every Marine deployment in the Mediterranean, in the far Pacific, wherever they go, they spend, the leadership of that deployment spends at least 2 or 3 days with the ambassadors and with the envoys and all that, going over the evacuations and the plans and the like. The evacuation really at some point in time becomes a military type operation, and that needs to be understood. And sometimes, for example, in the evacuation of Saigon, they waited too long. That evacuation was really, should have gone a couple days before it did, and it would have been much easier to accomplish. But those kind of things happen. But most of the evacuations have been, that I'm aware of, have been very successful, and I'm not aware of too much left behind problems. Maybe you and I should have a private discussion about that kind of thing. But I can remember, for example, in Mogadishu, we didn't leave much behind in the way of trouble. In fact, we planned to evacuate 67 people, and we actually evacuated 68 because one of our corpsmen delivered a baby on the way back to the ships. And so, you know, everybody works together. But at any rate, enough of this kind of thing. I did want to make no question about the social media. We have got to master that. We have got to use it in the right way, and we've got to not only do things the way the young people want to do it, but we got to make sure we educate our young people of what's right and what, you know, because the problem with the social media, of course, is anybody say anything and that's it. And so there has to be some way of developing an inherent sense of responsibility to this whole operation if it's going to be as effective as it really can be. The problem of resigning, ethically or otherwise, when you face a challenge. Most of us in senior positions, both ambassadors as well as military, have been in that position, and we have waited. And I think the thing that really drives it more than anything else is you say to yourself, can I do more good by staying, or can I do more good by leaving? I mean, you know, that's the kind of issue that really confronts you, because you're trying to help the country and you're trying to decide what's right. I remember, for example, after the Beirut bombing and the like, once Colonel Garrity and the battalion commander returned to the 2nd Marine Division, they were in my command. And that's when the word went out that nobody's going to touch them. You want to touch them, you got to touch me. And that's where it stopped. So those are the kind of things that you're faced with. Are they easy decisions? No. But you have to take a stand sometimes to make it happen. But thank you all very much for being with us, and thank you, both ambassadors, for a very lively discussion.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you, and
This was a unique
we follow the rule.